Hi everyone, my name's Michelle, and for those of you who don't know me, I manage the HR recruitment team here at Career Legal. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today on behalf of Career Legal, DVF and HYF Recruitment to our live panel discussion, Getting Comfortable with the Uncomfortable. Thank you for taking an interest in a topic that's extremely important to us, and it means a lot to me personally. As I'm sure most of you are aware, we take diversity and inclusion very seriously as a company, and during these unprecedented times, mental health has become an incredibly important issue. In the last week, 1 in 6 people have suffered with a mental health problem, and it can affect us all in many different ways, both directly and indirectly. For me personally, my experience has affected me indirectly. My eldest son was 9 years old when he started to become consumed by horrible thoughts, and he didn't understand them. He felt as though he couldn't escape. We were unaware at the time that he was also struggling with autism and ADHD, and it was these undiagnosed conditions almost certainly contributed to his state of mind. The road to recovery from this event has been long and challenging for my whole family, but thankfully, with the right medication and professional support, we're now moving in the right direction. Many mental health conditions can start in childhood. In fact, 50% of mental health problems start before the age of 14 and 75% by the age of 24. People will often carry these through into their adulthood, so an early intervention is crucial. It's essential that we keep talking and sharing our experiences. By keeping mental health conditions a secret, we unintentionally validate feelings of shame, which compounds the problem. We want to make sure that we keep the conversation moving in the right direction. We have a great panel of speakers here today who are very passionate about mental health and who have kindly agreed to discuss their topic and their own personal experiences with us. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our very own Alex Davies, who is a recruitment consultant here at Career Legal, Stephen Morell, who is the resourcing manager at Allen & Overy, and Carol Megan, who is the responsible business manager at Reed Smith. Thank you all so much for taking the time. We really appreciate you being involved in such an important topic. So we're going to kick things off now and learn a bit more about our speakers. So if you could all please just tell us a little bit about your own personal experience regarding mental health and how that has affected you. And Carol, if you'd please like to start. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Michelle, for that introduction. Thank you all for joining. And as Michelle said, my name is Carol Megan, and I'm the responsible business manager for our Europe, Middle East and Asia offices. But primarily I work in our London office, and I look after our Leeds office as well at Reed Smith. I manage all of our community outreach projects, which are focused on vulnerable areas of the community, our diversity, equity and inclusion programs, which are focused on young people of all ages, and our larger fundraising initiatives. I also help with our internal diversity, equity and inclusion focuses. My mental health illnesses are bipolar depression, complex PTSD, otherwise known as post-traumatic stress disorder, severe anxiety, and OCD, also known as obsessive compulsive disorder. But today I'm going to be talking about my personal experiences with bipolar depression and complex PTSD. Before I talk more about them, I would like to say at this point that I'm not speaking as a mental health specialist, but from my own experiences and treatments which on these two conditions, which are still very much unknown and unspoken about, less in regards to mental health illnesses. So first of all, I'm going to speak about my bipolar depression, which is otherwise known as bipolar type 2. This is another type of bipolar that can be misdiagnosed as clinical depression, which is also known as depression that requires medication to treat it. For over 45 years, I've been treated for clinical depression in many different forms, including acute postnatal depression. Treatment took the form of either antidepressants or CBT, which is also known as cognitive behaviour therapy. Sometimes this helped, but to be honest, didn't make me feel much better for very long. In May this year, after having a complete mental breakdown, I was referred to a psychiatrist, and after lengthy discussions, she diagnosed me with bipolar depression. This means that I have more lows than highs when I have an attack, and it can make me think of a lot of self-harm and suicide for many days, weeks and months. Antidepressants are not what I need because that continues with the low mood. I am now on antipsychotic medication, which is also used to treat psychosis, schizophrenia, and mania. And for a lot of people, that sort of medication can make them feel quite concerned. This has been a game changer and life restorer for me, and I now feel that it wasn't just in my head, but I actually have something more defining in regards to depression. My second illness that I'm going to speak about is my complex PTSD. Being diagnosed with this has been a revelation, as like many people, I thought that you could only experience this type of illness if you had witnessed horrendous acts of violence, like our service people who go to war, or people working in the emergency services witnessing death, violence, and risking their lives to save others. Again, until I was diagnosed by my psychiatrist and started treatment with my psychotherapist, this was unknown territory for me. For me, complex PTSD is like trying to heal three parts of myself: the child, the adolescent, and the adult in me. The best treatment for this is EMDR, which is also known as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It is very intense therapy, as you have to concentrate on traumatic incidents that have happened in your life. And then with the help of a sensor bar, currently used because of social distancing regulations, you concentrate on the movement of the bar, which helps to start to reduce the feeling of the trauma memory. I've only just started my therapy and I have a long way to go, but I feel confident that this will help me to heal the child and adolescents within me, allowing them to be put to rest and to help the adult me continue to deal with the more recent trauma, with the outcome of having a safe and happy life. I'm happy to answer any questions about these conditions to the best of my ability, and thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you so much, Carol, for sharing that. And Alex, if you'd like to share your story, please.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining this morning. I'm Alex Davis. Some of you might know me, I'm a recruitment consultant at Career Legal, and I have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. This is something that I've had all of my life. I can't remember childhood without it, but I didn't actually understand what OCD was until I was 21. So it was quite a long time of me not understanding why I thought in a certain way and why I acted in a certain way sometimes. So the first sign of it was I've got a really bad irrational phobia of cats. It's pretty debilitating sometimes. I can't go on holiday to countries where there's lots of cats because it's panic attack inducing, and I don't know why I'm scared. It's not that I think that they'll hurt me, it's more that they might touch me or come near me. And when I went to my GP, maybe in my very early teenage years, maybe I was 10 or 11, they decided that my thought process behind it was very obsessive and it aligned with OCD. So they put me on a waiting list to have therapy with CAMHS, but obviously CAMHS is a really under-resourced resource, so there were children who needed help way more than I did. So unfortunately I never got therapy through that, and it was almost forgotten about because it wasn't really explained to me. And then as I've gotten older, I realised that intrusive thoughts are actually one of the main things with OCD that people suffer from. So it can be anything. So for me, it's often things about death or illnesses, or I'll think really irrationally that something awful is going to happen. If something might be out of the ordinary, if, for example, my mum hasn't texted me by 9 a.m. in the morning, I'll automatically think something's happened on her way to work, things like that. But I suffered with these thoughts for as long as I can remember. And as a child, I felt like a very bad person. There was a lot of shame around it. And to protect yourself, you don't tell your parents about it or your friends or your family because you think that you're a bad person for thinking these things. So I developed coping mechanisms, a lot around food, and that has carried through to my adult life with certain foods not being able to touch. That's a really common one, not having sauces on certain things. And I just really didn't understand that all throughout my teenage years. Throughout university, I did a law degree, which was stressful. I had an accident in my first year, which was really traumatic, and I think masked a lot of my OCD because I was putting it down to the fact I'd been through this trauma, when actually it was my OCD which was progressively getting worse. And then it came to breaking point when I had my first kind of corporate role out of university. It got to the point where I just had a complete meltdown and had to go back to my GP because I just couldn't understand why I was acting the way I was, why I was thinking the way I was. And they revisited my notes and we talked a lot through it, and they explained exactly what OCD was, and it all made a lot of sense from there. So since that point, I think it's been about 2 years now, I've been learning how to cope with it and what things I can put in place to help myself and to manage my thoughts so that they're often quieter rather than all I can think about and consuming. So that can be through different mechanisms. Like I exercise a lot. I know that people say that, and it's quite a stereotypical response to mental health conditions. But I do find that having a good routine with things like that makes me feel good. And, following on from that, then my OCD thoughts are a lot quieter. So just little things like that. But I still feel like I'm quite early on in my journey, even though I've had it my whole life. I'm only now really understanding. So that's where I am today.
Thank you, Alex, for sharing your story. And Stephen, if you'd like to tell us a bit about yours.
Oh, good morning, everyone. And similar to everyone else, thank you for joining. So I'm Stephen Morrell. I'm the resourcing manager at Alden Overy, responsible for recruitment for our London office. And my journey, I think, similar to Alex, I think started quite a while ago. So probably early 20s or thereabouts. And my struggle really has been with anxiety from that time, and probably before then as well, although probably less aware of it. And I think what's interesting is given that I was in my early 20s and I'm now slightly older, it's been around for a long time. But at the point that it first sort of started to happen, I first started to be aware of it as being anxiety. It wasn't really something that you talked about. You didn't talk about feeling nervous or feeling anxious about things, or in my case, having panic attacks. The first one I had, I didn't know it was a panic attack. I just assumed I was dying. And I think that's kind of what happens in your brain is, there are these unknown symptoms and feelings, and you don't know what it is. And so you automatically, panic even more, and that doesn't help things. And then since then, I've had this sort of general anxiety. I don't have very many panic attacks, full-on panic attacks. It's more that sense that I'm going to, and that's what makes me anxious. So as a consequence of that, I try to control as much of my life as I can. And that can be very different, especially obviously at the moment with the global pandemic. There's very little you can do to control things. But where I can control things, I do. So whether that's socializing, whether that's my career, my relationships, whatever it might be, I am much more comfortable if I'm in control of that. And that's not from a position of just wanting to be controlling. It's because that way I can manage my anxiety. I, like Carol, have seen medical professionals and have had many different diagnoses over the years from different medical professions. I think anxiety especially is very difficult to pinpoint the exact cause of the anxiety. And often you don't know yourself. It takes a lot of work and a lot of talking with professionals to unlock that. And so I've had periods where I think, oh great, I now know what it is, and then it turns out someone else is telling me it's something different, or something else might be triggering the anxiety and the panic. It's affected my life in really different ways. As I say, from sort of being able to be social, I'm much more comfortable if I'm going to go out with friends, that it's people I know very well, that we're going somewhere I've been before. I know my escape routes. I know I can leave if I want to. It's become a lot about escape. I kind of describe it as claustrophobia, but of situations rather than spaces. If I know that I can leave somewhere, then I generally feel a lot better. But I've also found as the years have gone by, and I've gotten used to it. It's now, you know, a part of my life, and it's not something that is going to go away. It's something that's, I think, here to stay at this point. I found ways of coping with it and ways of managing it. And one of those is talking about it more. As it's become more acceptable to talk about it, and as people have opened up and shared their experiences, talking about it, whether that's with a medical professional, with friends, with colleagues, and finding out that you're not alone in this type of situation has really been very helpful. I do take medication as well, which helps. I'm not sure if it's a placebo or if it actually helps, but it helps. And so I tend not to question it too much. But I take an antidepressant every day, which, you know, it gives me that comfort. It also gives me a little bit of routine, that I'm doing something about it every day by taking that medication. And it's now gotten to the point where it's manageable. I do, with friends, with my partner, with colleagues, I do have occasions where I will automatically say no to things. And that's just my natural sort of, if I don't have to do it, I won't do it. Because that way I don't have the anxiety leading up to it. I don't have the anxiety about it and the nervousness around doing something. And so I do have people in my life that will challenge me on that and push me, and try and make me, you know, exceed those boundaries a little bit, which is really useful. I think you need those people around you that are understanding, but also not going to let you just wallow in it. It's difficult because they don't really understand how you're feeling, but if they can empathize with you and push you to do more than you think you can, then I think that's really useful, and has certainly been useful for me. Working in recruitment is unusual with this type of condition, because, you know, interviews I have very little control over. I get involved in a lot of interviews. I have to sit in a room with a candidate, often, you know, other interviewers as well. And for a long time, struggled with that because I felt trapped in that room, and I didn't enjoy interviews. I didn't enjoy meetings because of that. And I did them because obviously it was part of my job, but I entered each of them with a period of anxiety leading up to them. I've managed to cope with that a little bit, and I've actually had some very good advice, again, from medical professionals and others around how to deal with that. So my assumption that I can't leave the room is wrong. I can. It's unusual that someone would leave the room halfway through an interview, but it doesn't mean I can't do it. And so actually just knowing that, not necessarily knowing that I'm going to get up and leave the room, but knowing that I could, relieves that tension a little bit. And it was just something so simple as someone letting me know that. And I know, you know, many of you may think it's obvious you can leave if you want to, but you need sometimes someone to tell you that that's okay and that it's not unusual, because part of my anxiety stems from what if I get really anxious, but the other part of it is what if people notice that I'm really anxious? What if attention is on me because of that? What if I make a fool of myself because I'm feeling anxious about something? And so learning actually that, so what, often with, you know, with this case, you know, if it's a social thing, or if you're meeting people that you're never going to see again, who cares? You know, does it matter that they have this impression of you as being an anxious person? And so that was a really good piece of advice that I got, was sometimes just think, does it matter? You know, in the grand scheme of things, it's probably going to be fine. You're either never going to see this person again, or you'll see them again and it'll all be fine. They're probably not picking up on the same things that you think they are. But also people are much more understanding, I think. And so if you can talk about it and if you can explain it, then I think it becomes easier to deal with and easier to find your coping mechanisms.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I can really relate to a lot of what you're saying there. I see a lot of similar behaviours and things with my son. So yeah, really relate to you. Okay, thanks guys. We're going to move on to the next question. And that is, how did your diagnosis make you feel? I know for us personally, when my son received his, it was real kind of mixed emotions. So Alex, if we could go to you first, please.
Yeah, definitely. I think my diagnosis was almost twofold, because obviously I was really young when they first told me about it, and then not a lot happened with it. So it was almost forgotten about and just not understood. I thought my OCD was just my phobia of cats. So I kind of, put it off that, and then still thought I was a bad person for having these intrusive thoughts. And I think a lot of my thoughts are around things like food. And I think that's where it can get, well, for me, it got really confusing throughout teenage years and definitely throughout university. I went back to my GP, I think it was a year after my accident, because I was just feeling out of control. And it was a different GP, and they kind of just said, "You're anxious about food. Try and not be, try and meditate." And I knew that wasn't right, so it wasn't helpful. But then when I finally went back to the GP a year and a half later, and they kind of re-explained that this is really typical of OCD, and it was the first time I opened up about the thoughts, and they kind of were able to give me a lot of guidance and advice and people that I could then go and speak to. That made me feel a lot better, because I realised that I was able to separate me from my OCD, and I wasn't worrying so much anymore about me controlling my food, because I know for a lot of people that is an issue, but for me it's just a coping mechanism, which is healthy because I am healthy. So it's being able to explain that to your partner, your friends, saying why you weigh out your pasta is to make sure that I have a big enough portion, because my mind would tell me, no, if you have less, nothing bad's going to happen, things like that. And so I think it was a really good thing for me in the end. It was just unfortunately a bit of a long journey to get there.
Thanks, Alex. And Stephen?
Yeah, I think similar to Alex, I think it's been an interesting journey. I think for the first 10 years, 15 years maybe, I didn't talk about it with anyone. I didn't seek any professional help. It wasn't, as I say, it wasn't something that was really talked about as much then, and the resources that are available now certainly weren't available then. And so I went a long time without being diagnosed and just feeling, unusual and different, and that, then added to the anxiety of that I was feeling anyway. So it went a long time. So actually, once I then did seek help and seek sort of diagnosis, that in itself was quite uplifting, because it put a name to it. It put a diagnosis to it. Even if that diagnosis has changed since then, it put something to it where I just didn't feel like I was making it up, or this was just me suffering with it. It helped in that respect. I mean, I've been diagnosed as being claustrophobic, agoraphobic, social phobic. Who knows which of those or which elements of those are actually true? But knowing that the anxiety itself is real, albeit sometimes irrational, and I know that it's irrational, even sometimes while it's happening, it still doesn't give me as much control over it as I would like. And so those other coping mechanisms help. But I think just being diagnosed and having that reassurance that this is okay for you to feel this way will help you with it, and there are things you can do to manage it, but it's okay. It's not, you're not abnormal in any way. Has really helped. And I think, medication and things like that as well. I know I mentioned to you guys last week my little phrase from the final Harry Potter film at the end, where sorry if I'm spoiler alert for anyone that hasn't seen the final Harry Potter film, but at the end where Harry is on the train station with Dumbledore, and he says to Dumbledore, is this real, or is it just happening in my head? And I think that really resonates with me as a question, but Dumbledore's answer, which was, of course it's happening in your head. What makes you think that isn't real? I think was a really nice sort of summation of how I feel sometimes, that, you do think, oh my God, I'm just making this up. But it is real. The effects of it are real. The impact it has on your life is real. And so diagnosis, I think, is really key to understanding it and then moving forward with treatment. And that treatment will differ from one person to another, and it will differ from one diagnosis to another. But so long as you're doing something proactive, you are taking back a bit of control over your condition.
Thank you, Stephen, and a great quote as well. And Carol, if you could just talk us through how your diagnosis made you feel.
Yeah, so to be honest, I felt a real sense of relief. I think, especially with the bipolar depression, having been diagnosed for such a long time, of just having different forms of depression, being given different types of treatment, different types of medication, and for such a long time, like I mentioned when I spoke about my story, you know, it's been 45 years. It's a long time to be misdiagnosed and to be carrying around the feeling that, am I making it up? Am I, you know, is it just am I being paranoid? Am I, you know, feeling stuff that I'm not supposed to be feeling? And I think also with the fact that, you know, we're in such an extreme circumstance at the moment with COVID and everything, you know, I then started thinking, well, is it because of that? You know, because people say to me, yeah, I know how you feel. I feel like that sometimes. And I was thinking, well, maybe it's a reaction to the situation. But I knew that as I was spiraling, my mental health was spiraling more and more out of control. You know, I was really trying to hold on to it. And so to try and hold on to that, I was pushing forth by working extra hard and doing other things to try and distract what was going on in my head. So with the bipolar depression and the complex PTSD, you know, my complex PTSD is very visual. So it can be constantly like I'm running a film reel in my head over and over and over and over again. And it can be on one particular traumatic situation, or it can be many different situations that are just piling in together. And I kind of, when I was finally diagnosed, and also when I then went into a psychiatric unit to get my treatment, I remember speaking to the group and liking all my conditions, my illnesses, to characters. So for anyone who's seen Inside Out, you'll probably understand what I mean by characters. Each of them had their own little character, but they didn't have a character as a sort of person or anything. They were just a character as a name. So, you know, bipolar depression was a character, complex PTSD was a character, severe anxiety was a character, and OCD. And it was always a case of I wake up in the morning wondering who was going to be the front runner, who was going to be the person, who was going to be the illness that was taking control most. And I'd be the one sitting on the floor, cross-legged, watching all these illnesses, trying to veer for being the dominant illness. So for me, having the diagnosis and then being told, right, this is how we need to treat it, yeah, it gave me a real sense of relief. And also that it wasn't just in my head. It wasn't just me thinking I was unwell. But historically, it made sense why I was never making any progress and why I was never feeling any better after the treatments.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, and I agree with you that I think, you know, once you get that diagnosis, it is kind of a sense of relief because you realise that actually all those feelings and thoughts that you had, it's like someone's confirming them to you. So yeah, I completely understand what you're saying. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. Has the pandemic had an impact on your mental health, and how have you all been coping with that? I think it's impacted everybody, so keen to hear from you all on that one. Stephen, if you'd like to go first, please.
Yeah, sure. So I wrote an article on LinkedIn called The New Abnormal about this, because I think it has highlighted some things to me about my condition and my anxiety. And the article basically talks about the sort of beginning stages of the pandemic. And one of the things that I get very anxious about is change. And I've not always managed change as well as I maybe could, or have been reluctant to change in some areas. And this, again, work life in both areas. And so actually writing the article I found very therapeutic as well, just, you know, getting the thoughts out, writing it down. Because at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of change, obviously. You know, everyone went into lockdown and remote working and all of that sort of thing. And that for me was a big change. And so I felt some anxiety about that. But then as actually we progressed into months of that happening, it became the new normal or the new abnormal. And that gave its own comfort because I was at home. My meetings were all virtual. I wasn't having to go out and socialize with people. I had the perfect excuse to say no to things. And that became a little too comfortable. And so when our office then reopened at the end of the lockdown, I did go into the office. I made myself, I made up reasons why I needed to go in, just to force myself back into that kind of interaction again, because I felt that it was really necessary to do that. I then found that I was focusing on anxiety of what the future would look like. What happens if we then do go back to office working, or, something else happens? And I found myself focusing on that a little bit. And I think I had to come to the realization that we don't have any control over this. You manage your condition the best you can, and you engage with people around you, whether it's friends or colleagues, and really, share your story, listen to other people's stories, and hope that you can learn from each other as well. It's kind of why I wrote the article, was because I wanted to share my story, but I also wanted to share some hints and tips, which are in the article as well, which we can also share on here, but just some coping mechanisms and things I found that have worked, that really have helped with this during this pandemic. But it's certainly been, I think, for anyone suffering from any kind of mental illness, and as you say, anyone generally, there's been such change over the last year that I think it's affected everyone in some way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great article, Stephen. I've read it. And yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to what's in there. Carol, if you'd like to just talk through.
Yeah, so the impact for me was kind of twofold, really. I've said this many times to people, and they're quite surprised for me to be even saying this, but sort of the whole COVID situation actually saved my life. I think because I was doing things, I had a very good social life, active social life outside of work. I had very good work balanced life. So, I was always busy at work, and then I'd do things at the weekend, I'd do things in the evening. It kind of kept pushing everything back in my head that was going on. And so it allowed me not to really think about what was going on, but it was there. It was always constantly there. And so I think when the COVID situation happened, lockdown happened, we all had to work from home. What it did is it allowed me to have a safe space to have my mental breakdown, because it was always on the verge. I knew that at the time, and I was constantly trying to push against that. So for me, if this had not happened, I actually don't really sometimes want to think what could have happened, because of my state of mind. I really strongly believe that I could not be sitting here talking to you guys today, because I might have been in a very unsafe environment. It could be crossing the road to go to the office. It could be standing on the train platform waiting for that train. And because of the way that my mind and mental state was, and I was having these unhelpful thoughts about self-harm and suicide, unfortunately, I could have been one of those people that did something which could destroy my family's life as well as myself. So for me, it gave me that safe space to have to stop and, concede to the fact that these mental illnesses were taking effect, and I had to do something about it. But I think now that I'm going through the treatment, now that I've had therapy sessions, etc., it's what I'm now doing is I'm allowing it to use as a bit of a safety net. So I'm actually sort of hiding behind it like a shield, and I find that I can be quite isolating for myself. I find sometimes, a bit like Stephen, I can sort of use it as an excuse not to go out, or not to talk to people, or not to see anybody. And that's really not a good thing, because obviously the more isolated I am with my illnesses, the more I'm sort of focusing on them. So I've started doing things like going for walks every evening. So after I finish work, I call it my after work walk. And I spoke to a friend of mine about it, and they said, "Oh, why are you going out when it's all dark and it's cold, and aren't you worried about being out in the nighttime?" And I was like, no, because actually I prefer to be out at night when there's hardly anybody around and it is dark, because my anxiety doesn't go through the roof. I'm not worried about bumping into other people. It doesn't trigger off my OCD before I leave the house. And actually what it does, it gives me that sense of just relief of switching off from work and just having a walk, headphones plugged in, listening to some music, and then just, refreshing my head.
Thanks, Carol, for your honesty there. And yeah, as I mentioned to you the other day, my son also likes to go out for walks in the evening as well. He likes being in the darkness, and for the same reason, he's not going to bump into anybody and he can just wander around freely. Okay, Alex, and the same question to you. Thanks.
I spoke with my partner about this last night because I thought that the pandemic hadn't really had an impact on my mental health. It's probably where I'm trying to be really positive, and maybe I kind of don't pay attention to my little wobbles. But I think at the start I did have quite a few wobbles. I found the lack of, well, there was no control. And for me, I think that really set me into a bit of a spiral of just feeling very on edge. That's the only way I can describe it, is when my thoughts are louder, but I was aware that they were my OCD thoughts and they weren't true and they weren't going to happen. But at the same time, you can't stop them. So I was doing a lot of running. I find that really, it does help. If you want to clear your mind, things like going for a walk, going for a run, it's great. But I took it too far. And then it becomes counterproductive because I was becoming obsessed with, if I didn't go or if I didn't beat my personal best every single day, something bad was going to happen. So I think that I used the time off in the pandemic where we were on furlough and we, weren't having to go anywhere. I couldn't go home, to really try and push things. So, I stopped running. I did some yoga, which was okay. I tried food combinations that I normally would avoid. And I just used it to try and push some of my, comfort boundaries that I've been really rigid with. So I think obviously that had a good effect, but also it brought out other things. Like, I've realised that in my relationship, I need a lot of reassurance. And I think that it's a very common thing in OCD from people I've spoken to and things that I've read, that can be a really common issue for people, is needing reassurance. So I've been trying to work out ways that I can reassure myself rather than needing someone like Michelle as my manager or my mum or my partner to reassure me that everything is okay. So I think it's been overall positive. But I think, it's affected everyone. So yeah, a bit of a bumpy road maybe.
Thank you, Alex, again for your honesty. Okay, we'll move on to the next question now, guys. So how have your current employers supported you through your difficult times? And Carol, if we could go to you first, please.
Sure. So first of all, I must say my employers have been absolutely amazing. I mean, I had a total of 11 weeks off sick, and that was including spending just over 4 weeks of that in a psychiatric unit at the Priory Hospital in Kent. And throughout the whole time, I had amazing support from the HR team. They were constantly checking in on me. They helped me when I needed a slight extension on my stay at the psychiatric unit. They were, my HR director was fantastic in really getting that sorted through our private health plan providers. But overall, yeah, they have been super, super helpful in keeping me grounded, making sure they're in touch with me. So when I came back on a slightly reduced hour basis, return to work, one of the HR team checked in with me every week to make sure I was okay. My supervising partner boss is checking in on me even now. Every week we have a call, only for like half an hour or so, just to sort of check in and find out that I'm okay. If there's any sort of needs that I need from HR or anybody else within the team. My team have been amazing. I've got a super, super team who I can't thank enough for really keeping on, in check with me and all the rest of it. And just colleagues throughout the firm as well. But I think with all the help and support and just acknowledgement that, what I've gone through has, been something really difficult, but have allowed me to be really transparent and open. And through all the kind of the support systems they have in place for just not just me, the other people who are going through mental health illnesses, yeah, that's been paramount for my recovery.
Sorry, thank you, Carol, and it's really great to hear the amount of support that you've had, so that's great. Alex, over to you.
I think for me it's a bit of a different environment. Career Legal is obviously a lot smaller than Allen and Overy and Reed Smith. But I think the biggest thing for me is being able to have an open channel with people on my team or who sit on our pod, especially with Michelle, just because I find that I might do things a little bit differently to how other people do things, and they're aware of that, and they just let me get on with it in the way that, you know, I'm feeling comfortable to do so. So I think that just having that person who you can talk to if you're feeling a bit uneasy or a bit upset about something, who, you know, isn't going to judge you, and you know that they can kind of just listen, not necessarily give advice, and just say, okay, I hope you're okay. I think that that's really important, to have an inclusive environment where you feel like you can be yourself. So I think that's the biggest form of support that I need in a role. And I think that hopefully most people will get that in a team. But I think that that really helps with the day-to-day and the difficult days as well.
Thanks, Alex. And Stephen?
Yeah, I think it's been a bit of a journey. So obviously there was a long period where I didn't talk about it at work, and it wasn't really talked about. And again, you know, there was a period where this wasn't just discussed openly. It wasn't a done thing. That's definitely changed. And it was actually a colleague at work that first advised me, following a conversation with them about their anxiety, first advised me to seek medical help and a diagnosis. And that, I think, you know, broke the doors open there for me to be able to move forward and actually be more confident about talking about it. I'm not someone that does talk about my feelings a lot. I'm not a very touchy-feely person, but I think it's important to know that you can. And I think what Allen and Overy have really embraced is that openness, that ability to be who you are, talk about who you are, seek help where you want to, ignore it all if you want to as well. You know, it's not rammed down your throat, but there are a number of things that are available to us at work in terms of there are mental health allies that you can go and talk to that, you know, specifically put their hands up. I think Carol has similar things where she is as well. We have mental health advocates as well. So these are partners within the firm who, you know, really embrace mental health and mental well-being. And so just knowing that it's sort of from the top down is quite reassuring. We signed up to the Mindful Business Charter recently, and so that's, you know, an acknowledgement from the firm and from management that it is a stressful role working within a law firm, and, you know, whether you're a fee earner or support staff, and there are high expectations and there are deadlines and all of that sort of thing, and there's probably not much you can do about that. Those are, you know, going to remain. But the Mindful Business Charter, I think, is really making us focus on how do we be kinder about those things? How do we be fairer about those things? How do we be mindful, for want of a better word? And I think that really helps. You know, we have, in addition to that, we have speakers that come in and talk about their stories, both medical professionals, celebrities that we've had come in and talk about their journey with mental well-being. And that all helps as well. It elevates the conversation, and it really does get that out there. But I think number one for me is people. You know, surrounding yourself with people who have similar views to you on being open about these sort of things, and that you can go to and talk to. I've got, you know, a number of colleagues that are really good friends now, both past and present colleagues who are really good friends now that I can talk about openly about these things, and they'll share their experiences with me. And I think that's been hugely supportive, is just the resources available at the top level, but also the people that you know you can go to for help, or just to have a chat or get something off your chest if you want to.
Thanks, Stephen. And it's really great to hear that businesses have allies and advocates for mental health. I think it's so important that people keep these conversations moving. So that's really nice to hear. Okay, and we're going to move on to the last question. Do you have any advice and tips or support resources that you can share with others that might be directly or indirectly affected by this? And Alex, if you'd like to go first, please.
I think it's a big question, and there's loads of amazing resources. Charities like Mind are fantastic at having really concise explanations of different mental health illnesses that you can send on to family or friends who might not understand it and might want to go away and research it. So I'd say that's a really good place to start. And on there as well, they've got lots of people that you can chat to talk through things if you're unsure, or if you were doing it on behalf of a child, or someone that you lived with that you thought might be struggling. But I guess my biggest thing of advice, and what I've really tried to put into practice, is setting personal boundaries. And I think it's a difficult thing to do, especially if you're a bit of a people pleaser and like to say yes to things because you don't want people to think that you're rude or that you don't care. So examples that I do for my personal boundaries, I don't really drink as a general rule, because I find that feeling of being out of control can affect me for kind of, a week afterwards. And I've learned that unless I'm feeling super secure in myself and in a really good positive mindset, I just won't now. And I'll explain to my friends why. And I think if people, are true friends or care about you, they won't mind if you don't drink, as long as you go and you make the effort to kind of show face and be there. They don't mind. If you don't want to do things like that. I won't go to friends' houses anymore who have cats, where I used to when I was younger. And I think that's been something that they've had to get used to, because I always used to, and I'd just be terrified and on edge and on the verge of a panic attack for pretty much the whole time I'd be there. But now I think you just have to let people know that it's not personal. It's just, can we go somewhere else, or you can come to my house? So doing things like that, I think, really will help you feel a bit more in control of situations where you might be a bit nervous. So I think that's my biggest piece of advice, is to really have a think about what boundaries you need to set, and they can change as well, but that would be my advice.
Thanks, Alex. And yeah, you're right, Mind is a really great place to start as well. Stephen, any tips from you?
Yeah, I think Mind, again, I think it's fantastic, and we use that as well. I think the Samaritans is something that often gets thought of as being, much more in the charity bracket rather than support bracket, but it is. I think it's something that, if you're struggling, it's a definite sort of first port of call. I think the power of actually getting diagnosis, for me, was extremely helpful. It sounds like it was for Alex and Carol as well. So, you can spend, and the internet wasn't quite what it is now back then, but you can spend time researching on the internet, what your symptoms are, and therefore trying to self-diagnose. And often that can lead you down a very dark path where you start catastrophizing or, going to worst case scenarios. So actually, I would say seeking that professional medical opinion and diagnosis was really helpful for me. And then I think, as I've said, surround yourself with people who are a good mixture of understanding and challenging, because that's really been really helpful for me, because there are times where I do need them to understand and just accept that I'm not going to change my mind about something, or I'm not going to do something. And then there are other times where actually you probably do need to push me a bit, because I will become far too comfortable in that pit of despair or pit of anxiety and stay there. And so I think surrounding yourself with people and talking about what is affecting you and how it's affecting you is really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I agree with you that I think it is important to get a diagnosis. I think for us personally, there was minimal help and support available, but the minute my son received his diagnosis, we suddenly were kind of in a position that we could contact various different professionals and get help. So yeah, I agree, that's really important. Carol, any tips and resources from you, please?
Yes, I think my main advice would be that if you feel that you've got any changes in your mental health state, then to speak to someone, maybe speak to somebody that you feel really comfortable and trust, first of all, just to kind of start that conversation going, to see whether it's something that could be leading on to something more serious, or if it's just, you just need somebody that you can just have a conversation with. Because like we've said already, you know, this situation that we're living in is really, really difficult. It's very unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. We're still kind of wading through what life's going to look like on the other side. And so sometimes for people, they may feel like their mental state has changed, but it may be just that they just need that conversation with somebody, because we are pretty much working in very isolated times at the moment. I'd also say that if you do feel that you need more professional support, or, you know, somebody you've spoken to recommends that maybe you do speak to someone else, you know, maybe start with your GP. They're always good call to have that conversation with a professional person. And then if they feel that you need to be elevated to something more in a more specialised consultancy type scenario, like I was, which is, you know, thankfully my GP recognised that she needed to elevate me and, you know, pass me on to someone who was more specialised. Then, you know, take that on board and don't feel scared about it, because those people are there to help you. They're not there to make you feel shameful of yourself or embarrassed or anything. They're there to actually, you know, set you on the right road of recovery. So just embrace that and take that on board. It's really essential, I think. Stephen touched on it about the Googling. I would definitely say to people, don't Google symptoms and self-diagnose. It's a really tricky road to go down. If you do feel something's not right, speak to your GP, or speak to, if you've got any private health providers within your firm, organisation you work with, speak to them. Most of them now have mental health teams, which is amazing. That's how I found out about seeing a psychiatrist, was through the mental health team of our health providers. Both Alex and Stephen mentioned the Samaritans and Mind Centre, the Mind charity, which are, you know, fantastic organisations to speak to. But recently I heard on the radio that the NHS has now started a therapy website talk, and it's called NHS Talking Therapies, and the website is nhs.uk/talk. And that's been put recently a lot on the radio for people to reach out to the NHS and speak to, again, people who can help with mental health advice. So I just wanted to kind of give that a little bit of a shout out as well for anybody who wanted to look into that further.
Thank you, Carol. And for all of the resources that we've mentioned, we will be putting that all on the website so people can access that information. But yes, you're right, Carol. I think in the first instance, you should just have a chat with your GP. They're there to help. Okay, so I wondered if anybody had any questions for each other. So if you all wanted to unmute yourself. Alex, I don't know if you've got a question that you'd like to ask either Stephen or Carol.
Yeah, I've got a question for Stephen, and it's around, I guess, the stigma for men with mental health. I wondered if you had any experience with it, how you think it might have affected your journey more over the years, because obviously now there's a lot of talk about it, but I think historically, you know, people say things like "Man up, boys don't cry." Yeah, how's that been for you?
Yeah, it was definitely something that I was aware of. Before diagnosis, you know, I think at that time where I'm just like, oh, I don't want to be seen as just an anxious man. Like, is that how I'm going to be perceived, and is that going to be seen as you know, derogatory in some way? And I think it was, to a certain degree. And so there was definitely a stigma around it. I do think, as you say, it's changed. I think there is more awareness now that this is something that affects any gender, and it's not, you know, you're not seen as being less masculine or more masculine if you talk about your feelings. I think when we look at, and again, to give a sort of an Alan Overy example, when we look at some of the guest speakers that we've had come in, that you wouldn't think that these are people that suffer with these conditions or these illnesses, and they are, and they're happy to talk about them. And I think when you look at, you know, social media and the number of celebrities there that are talking about their mental health and their mental well-being, a lot more openly. I think it's great that there is now much more of an understanding that this is something that affects men as well. But I definitely do think that there was a stigma attached to it previously, and something that I probably struggled with quite a lot in the early days of my condition. I don't think about it as much now. I think because it's just become a part of my life now, my condition is part of who I am, and so I don't think about it in terms of gender as much as I used to, which is actually quite nice that I don't have to have that myself.
Thanks, guys. And actually, sorry, if we could just mute ourselves when we're not speaking, because there's a little bit of interference going on there. Stephen, did you have a question for either Alex or Carol, please?
Yeah, I actually had a question for Alex and Carol as well, actually, because I know you've suffered with OCD as well. I think, you know, part of my anxiety, as I mentioned earlier, is control, and that can then come across as, you know, being quite controlling and wanting to have that control. And people have definitely referred to me as being OCD before, or having OCD tendencies. I just wondered if either of you sort of have faced, I guess, a stigma around it. It seems to me in the family of mental illnesses or mental health, it seems to be the one that is trivialized the most, because if you are someone that just likes things to be tidy, there doesn't seem to be the same restrictions of language that's used. So, you know, someone will quite happily say, oh, you're a bit OCD because you're tidy or because you do things in a certain order. And I just wondered if you'd both sort of face that same sort of stigma around it and how you've responded to that.
Carol, if you want to answer the question first so you don't talk over each other.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I totally get the feeling that sometimes it's kind of brandished around. OCD is something which everyone has and everyone's got a touch of it and everyone wants to say, yes, I'm a bit OCD. But yeah, there is definitely a difference between actually having OCD and just being someone who is either tidy or very organized, or, you know, my OCD kind of manifests itself in checking. So I do checks, but it's not like the same time. I won't do the same checks in the same place. So I've moved, say, for example, I've moved houses a few times recently for various reasons, and my checks have all changed depending on where I'm living. But my checks all manifest because it's all about keeping people safe, keeping my loved ones safe. So I do it to keep my loved ones safe. And if I don't do it in a sort of order at a particular time, then I worry about them coming to some sort of harm, or, you know, that if I don't do it, that if they do come to harm, it's my fault. But I kind of also liken it a bit like a child, an active child who kind of wants to play a game and wants to play the same game over and over again. But I have find it very debilitating as well. I remember one particular house I lived in, and my checks became so overwhelming that I was actually making myself late for work, missing the normal train I would get, because I had to make sure I did them in the right order at the right time. You know, and it was weird things like walking out the front door backwards so that I could see that I was leaving, walking down the path and having to look back at a certain stage as I was walking. So, you know, true OCD, people who truly have OCD, it's very debilitating, and it can be quite scary, because sometimes you think it's taking over your life. And I think that's the difference between people who are just like I said, a bit more organised than others, or you know, a bit more of a, you know, somebody who likes to clean more often than others. You know, it's a very fine line, but I think we do need to have to sort of take a step back and kind of really look at the situation as to whether it is OCD or if it's just something that people like doing more of.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carol. And Alex, if you wanted to answer the same question.
Yeah, I think that you're so right, Carol and Stephen, with saying that, you know, people use the term OCD in such a blasé way. I think, obviously, as someone with OCD, you probably pick up on it a lot more when you hear people saying it nearly weekly in an office environment. Someone's joking about it. And I think that people never do it to be malicious. And when you explain to them why it has upset you a little bit in a polite way, people are always mortified and really apologetic and just have no concept of what OCD can actually be like. And so that's why I really wanted to talk about my OCD, which I've never done before in my life, because I think that when people hear about it and understand it a bit more, they won't trivialize it, and they won't just say it off the cuff that, oh, my OCD is going crazy because those two tiles don't align, things like that. I think that if people really knew the types of thoughts that can come with OCD, they wouldn't joke about it, and they would, you know, I think they'd feel bad about it and try and understand with people who do have it. It's very, very different to, I think, what's shown on TV with people like Monica from Friends. It's a typical one, isn't it? Everybody thinks that she is OCD. So yeah, I think it's just important to be polite in saying it. But if you do hear people joke about it, kind of just explain what it is, and then people never do it again. And I think that if we can raise awareness for it, that will happen less and less, because when you're going through a particularly tough time with your OCD, hearing people joke about it can reduce you to tears, because you just want to shout at them. You know, if you knew what was happening, you wouldn't be joking. So I think it's an important thing to be mindful of, definitely.
Thanks, Alex. We're running out of time, but Carol, if you had one quick question for Alex or Stephen before we go.
Yeah, I had a question for both, really, and we can keep it really kind of simple, the answer. But knowing what you know now about yourself as an adult, what would you have said to your younger self, you know, going through with your illnesses at that point?
Stephen?
I think I would have. It's difficult, really, because I think even as an adult self, people telling me stuff, you know, often you need to find that on your own a little bit. And so I think, you know, I could have gone back and said, you know, don't worry about it so much, try and get help quicker. I think that's the thing I probably would have said, is try and get help sooner, because I do think it becomes a pattern of behavior. Like once you've suffered with something for a while, your ways of coping become your way of life. And I do wonder if I'd gotten medical treatment a lot earlier, if it wouldn't have progressed as much as it has. Because it's certainly, you know, there are different things that have been added to my anxiety list over the years, and maybe they wouldn't have if I'd had that treatment earlier. And those triggers wouldn't have become part of my daily life. So I think my biggest piece of advice would have been seek help and, you know, talk about it and get diagnosed, because I think that would have helped. I think I've tended to catastrophize things, you know, small trivial things that happen. You know, an example is getting my hair cut. I once felt anxiety while getting my hair cut, and so I then decided that getting my hair cut made me anxious. And so every time I get my hair cut now, I feel anxious. And I think if I'd known earlier that, you know, medication and therapy could have helped, maybe I wouldn't have had that anxiety getting my hair cut that one time, and it wouldn't have then become a way of life. So I think definitely seek help earlier would be what I would have said.
Thanks, Stephen. Alex?
I think I would just tell my younger self that I'm not a bad person, my thoughts aren't real, and no one's going to judge you for them. You can talk to your parents and your friends and your siblings about the thoughts that you have, and it's not your fault. So I think that's what I tell myself.
Great. Thanks, guys. Okay, so we're just out of time now, but I'd like to say a big thank you to all our speakers here today for giving us some really interesting, insightful, honest and touching stories. We have recorded this live session and we will be sending it out to everyone who registered, along with those support links that we talked about, which you may find useful. If you submitted a question and we didn't get the opportunity to answer it, then I apologise. We've obviously run out of time, but I will we'll try and get back to each and every one of you. I would also just like to mention that our discussion here today is simply to share our own personal experiences with regards to mental health. So please don't take it as professional or medical advice. We're not experts, nor are we medically trained in this area. The content shared today is not intended to be a replacement for therapy or any professional help. So please speak to your doctor or a professional if you're worried about your mental health, or if you need someone to talk to, please refer to the list of contacts which we'll share on our diversity and inclusion page on our website. Thank you again from everybody here at Career Legal, DVF and HYF Recruitment, and please keep your eye peeled for some other seminars that we'll have coming up in the future on www.careerlegal.co.uk. And thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.